At any rate, it's my pleasure to introduce Bill O'Neill. He's a longtime friend, a companion. I've known him for years. Bill has written 20 books. He's written 300 articles at least. He has appeared on the History Channel, the Learning Channel, and a half a dozen other channels. He's one of these remarkable individuals who's written so many histories and biographies it's difficult to count them, but among his best are a history of the Arizona Rangers, an encyclopedia of gunfighters, which I'm embarrassed to admit, but I shall. I've copiously copied it, and it'll appear under a slightly different name through the facts on file out of New York come November, December of this particular year. But anyhow, he also wrote a great biography of Tex Ritter, and anybody who writes great biographies, particularly of Tex Ritter, has to be a nice guy and a good guy. And with that, I'd like to bring forth Bill O'Neill. I'm very good.
Thank you, Leon. It's a privilege to be here, and I mean that. My first involvement with Warren Earp days was last year, and I frankly didn't know what to expect when I came. Well, after 3 days, I realized that for those of us who are fascinated by Old West gunfighters, this is a premier event. This is a gathering of kindred spirits. We can all interchange with the top experts, the best researchers and writers in this field that we love. So it is a real privilege for me to be here. And I want to publicly thank Michael Hickey for organizing, for putting together this truly important Wild West event. When Michael asked me to provide an introductory program, I knew that I didn't want to deal directly with this year's theme. I'll leave that to our panel of Earpiana experts. I'm not even in their league as far as the Earps are concerned. So I talked to him about it in a couple of notes. Michael offered suggestions. I'll pull a sentence or two out of each note. I've decided to put you to work. I've slotted you in for half an hour on opening day, sort of put everybody in the mood. Okay, so in order to put everybody in a gunslinging mood, I number crunched nearly 600 shootouts and over 250 gunfighters. It's a study I've continued now for nearly 3 decades. And today I want to talk about 3 things: the greatest gunfighters, some miscellaneous information from my number crunching, and a final few minutes about the greatest shootouts. Now, who was the greatest gunfighter who ever lived? Well, to a Westerner of about 100 and something years ago, the greatest gunfighter was probably the one who just shot you. To those of us who look back upon the Western gunfighter with a tinge of nostalgic admiration, there seems to be a dangerous excitement about men such as Doc Holliday, Billy the Kid, Johnny Ringo, Wyatt Earp. But in this second year of the 21st century, with the Old West fading into the past, the only way for us to judge the best of the frontier shootists is to take a hard look back at the available evidence. So who were the men whose inclinations or occupations repeatedly embroiled them in violent confrontations? Well, they were men who wore guns, and as you know, not everybody in the West did. Men who drank, men who hung around saloons where others drank and inevitably quarreled with each other. And I want to come back to that drinking saloon thing in just a second. Men who had bad tempers or a touchy sense of honor and pride. Men who were lawmen, sworn to control rowdies and arrest lawbreakers, or men who were outlaws, who found it necessary to use their guns against bankers or other citizens reluctant to surrender their property. I want to show you something. I was fiddling around with these numbers. I'm working with 590 gunfights, which all the major ones, OK Corral, et cetera, and gunfights of all the major gunfighters and a lot more. I found that fatal fights, in other words, gunfights in which at least one guy got killed, 408 out of the 590. That's 69%. Basically then, 7 out of 10 times that these guys drew their guns, somebody got killed. In fact, usually more than some one person. The number of fatalities in those 408 gunfights, 638. It's about 1.5 person per shootout. 182 gunfights that I studied, no one was killed. That's only 31%. That's, well, those are pretty deadly encounters. Now, of the 590 gunfights, I know of 137 for sure, about a fourth, that occurred in saloons or that involved drunken participants. All right, 100 of these alcohol-induced shootings, that's 100 out of 137, 73% higher than this average. 100 of these alcohol-induced shootings produced 150 deaths, again, even higher percentage. So liquor apparently had very little effect on the aim of Westerners. You know, we got a lot of people who, if they lived in the 1800s, you know, they might have done just fine out there. Or maybe they were less aware of fear when in their cups, or they were less agile at ducking, or they were more determined to kill while drinking. I think I'm right. All but 2 of Doc Holliday's gunfights occurred in saloons. The same number certainly applies to Wild Bill Hickok. All of Rowdy Joe Lowe's gunfights were in one western watering hole or another. And like Wild Bill, he was killed in a saloon. Hickok was killed in Deadwood Saloon number 10. Wes Hardin was killed in El Paso's Acme Saloon. Warren Earp was shot dead in the Corner Saloon here in Wilcox. Dallas Studenmeyer was killed in a wild saloon fight in El Paso, killing Jim Miller. Shotgun Sheriff Bud Frazier in a Toyah, Texas saloon. Both father and son, Texas gunmen Emmanuel Clements and Manny Clements, were slain in saloons in 1887 and 1908, respectively. Dave Rudabaugh killed 2 men over a card game in a Mexican cantina. He fought his way outside, but then very foolishly went back inside. The building was now darkened. They mobbed him, threw him down on the floor, and beheaded him with machetes. A great number of Western gunmen were killed either while they were drunk or by drunks. Fred White, Tombstone, Ed Masterson, Dodge City, Bill Tillman, Warren Earp, and the list goes on and on and on. I fooled around a little bit with first gunfights. When did you, do the entry-level gunfighter thing? Wes Hardin and John Younger killed a grown man when they were 15 years old. Modern 15-year-old kids have just begun high school. John Hughes was in his first gunfight. Now, he took the worst of that when he was 15. Cole Younger, when he was 16, killed a man with a pistol shot measured at 71 yards. Ben Thompson got in his first conflict at that age. Billy the Kid was 17 when he killed Blacksmith at Fort Grant, which is just north of us here. Jesse James was 17. Henry Brown pumped 3 slugs into a fellow cowboy in the Texas Panhandle when he was 18. Bob Younger, Charlie Beaudry, Ira Ayton, Cherokee Bill Goldsby, 18. At 19, Henry Starr killed a lawman in a ferocious 1892 shootout. Earp experts, Johnny Behind the Deuce, was he 19 when he killed a gambler? Is that true? Bill Tillman, El Fago Baca, Cullen Baker, 19. Now, lots more teenagers, but aside from the teenagers, in 250 some odd gunfighters, half of them were in their 20s. Bob Ford and Henry Plummer, for instance, 20, among the better known ones. Clay Allison was 21. Doc Holliday was 22, and so was Bat Masterson and Kingfisher. Billy Thompson was 23. Wild Bill Hickok, 24. Butch Cassidy and Luke Short, 25. Sundance Kid, 26, and on. A fourth of them, interestingly enough, were in their 30s. If I'm right about this, White and Morgan Earp each were 30. Dallas Studenmeyer was 30. Virgil Earp's 33, first time. Bill Doolin. And another thing, well over half of these first-timers killed at least one man during their first shootout. Pretty impressive. Now, who are the best gunfighters? All right, in considering such men, I think you have to start with Wild Bill Hickok, the Prince of the Pistoliers. He was big, strong, adventurous man. Hickok saw combat with the Army in the Civil War on the frontier as an Indian scout. And in 1861, after cavorting with the mistress of Dave McCandless, he killed McCandless when Dave and his 2 friends came after him. And then he shot the 2 friends who were finished off by Hickok's friends. Harper's Monthly Magazine wrote up the story of Hickok's fight with a McCandless gang, adding numerous embellishments and spreading Wild Bill's reputation. Wild Bill greatly added to that reputation when, just after Civil War, he agreed to meet a former Union soldier named Dave Tutt in a street duel. It was not at high noon, it was at 6 o'clock in the evening, but an expectant crowd of spectators gathered to watch these two acquaintances shoot it out over a disputed card game and a whore named Susanna Moore. At 75 yards distance, Wild Bill shouted, "Don't come any closer, Dave." But Dave pulled a pistol, squeezed off a round, so Wild Bill then steadied his cap and ball revolver with his left hand and fired a slug directly into Tutt's chest. Dave fell dead in one of the very few pre-planned face-to-face street duels in Western history. Now, Hollywood, of course, invented the fast draw contests that captivated many of us early in life. It looked good on the screen to climax a film with an athletic encounter to see which gunfighter was quicker on the draw. Of course, if you study gunfights, you realize it didn't much matter who whipped out his gun first if you missed. But, you know, in the movies, they were always going to, who was fastest, they were always going to hit for sure. Looked good on screen, and so did fanning. Soon you could no more have a Western movie, or later a Western TV show, or of course a Western novel, without a fast draw scene, or better still, several fast draw scenes, and you could have a modern mystery movie, a detective film without a car chase. There was also lots of fanning in the movies and the Buscadero rigs to make the fast draws quicker, and a lot of shooting guns out of the hands. You know, they did that, a lot of shooting without reloading. You remember Roy Rogers' line, well, the reason they called it a Colt 45 is because you can shoot it 45 times without reloading. Well, nobody in the real West fanned their guns in a fight, and almost nobody met in the street. Nobody ever let the other guy draw first. Nobody ever tried to shoot the gun out of the other guy's hand. They just started shooting, and if the other guy was armed and was shot in the front, a coroner's jury would gather and rule self-defense, even if the dead man never pulled his gun. Now, Wild Bill Hickok didn't fan his guns, and he never tried to shoot out any gun out of anybody's hand. He shot to kill. He killed Dave McCandless, and he killed Dave Tutt, whom he did meet in the street. In 1869, he was in 3 gunfights, and he killed a man in 2 of those shootouts. Other one, he got shot, 3 flesh wounds. 1870, he shot 2 men in a saloon fight in Hays City. 1871, he killed Phil Coe in Abilene. And then he wheeled around and killed another peace officer who was run up to help him. It was an accident, but interestingly enough, in the remaining 5 years of his life, until he was shot in the back of the head in a Deadwood saloon, Hickok's not known ever to have fired another shot at a man. But Wild Bill had a colorful life, and he died by the gun. And within a 10-year span, from the time he was 24 until he was 34, he fought in military combat, and he killed 7 men and shot 2 others in 7 gunfights. He was the quintessential Western gunfighter. One of the very first gunfighters was also one of the best. Although born in England, Ben Tombstone was raised in Texas. In 1858, when he was 16, he pumped a load of birdshot into a black guy, and the next year he had another adolescent shooting scrape. Ben drank and gambled and courted trouble all his life. He was in at least 14 gunfights. He killed 4 men. He helped kill 2 others, and he wounded a few more. Finally, when he was 41, he was assassinated by enemies in San Antonio, along with another notorious gunman, King Fisher. John Wesley Hardin has to be included among the all-time greats, but with a qualification. You know, he was from a distinguished Texas family. His father was a Methodist minister who named his son after the founder of Methodism in the hope that West, too, would join the pulpit. But when he was 11, young West revealed that killer instinct, stabbing another boy in the chest and back during a knife fight. The boy didn't die, but West did better when he was 15, pumping 3 slugs into the chest of an ex-slave during the bitter Reconstruction era. Well, now he's on the run. He hid out, by the way, in the county where I was born and raised. He had a number of scrapes with Reconstruction soldiers and state policemen and other law officers sent to arrest him. He wrote an autobiography, and he said he added all these up, Miss 40 or 44. I never did believe that they're too similar, and I never did believe all of those. There were a lot. Leon tried to work that out in his masterful biography of Hardin. Anyway you cut it, some of his shootouts are well documented, most notably during that bloody Sutton-Taylor feud in South Texas. He killed Sheriff Jack Helm in 1873, the next year a deputy sheriff in Comanche. But anyway, he killed a lot of guys. Now, Hardin himself was killed when he was 42 in El Paso by another man on my list, a very rough customer named John Selman. Frontier ranchman, he fought Indians and he became a rustler, and he organized a gang of thieves called Selman Scouts. Also fought in Indian combat, but he didn't begin gunfighting until he was 36. He became so efficient very quickly that he was elected city constable in El Paso. Acting in that capacity in 1894, he wound up in a wild shootout in Tilly Howard's sporting house. Deputy Marshal, an ex-Texas Ranger named Baz Outlaw, got drunk, started shooting everything, and he killed one of Selman's officer friends and shot Selman twice in the leg, and then Selman killed him. Next year, Wes Hardin, recently released from 17 years in prison, quarreled with Old John and John Selman Jr., who was an El Paso policeman too. Old John sought Hardin out in the Acme Saloon, shot Hardin down, then stood over him, shot him twice more to make sure. John Jr. ran in and said, "Don't shoot him anymore, Daddy, he's dead." Old John surrendered to his son and then promptly benefited from a hung jury. The next year, Old John, 56 now, tangled with fellow officer George Scarborough, and one night when John was drunk, Scarborough stitched him with 4 bullets, and that was the end of him. You have to be impressed by another El Paso shootist, Big Dallas Studenmeyer. Frequently wounded as a young Confederate soldier during the Civil War, he later fought Indians for 2 years as a Texas Ranger, then he became a rancher. 1876, he had his first gunfight. Shot his opponent fatally, then walked over to watch him die. The next year he was wounded, but the next year he was involved in killing 3 men in one shootout. 1881, he became city marshal of El Paso. And 4 days after arriving, he charged in the middle of one of the West's bloodiest street fights. 4 men were killed. Studenmeyer, working both guns, accounted for 3 of them, including one who was an innocent bystander. Bad luck. Dallas ended the melee by pumping a bullet into the last gunman still standing. "You big son of a bitch," he gasped. "You murdered me." Well, they carried him away, and he proved to be correct. 3 nights later, Dallas and his brother-in-law were ambushed by a man who opened up with a shotgun. Dallas and his brother-in-law whipped out their 6 guns and pumped 8 bullets into the man. The last round severed his testicles. Other hidden gunmen opened fire, but Dallas charged them despite being wounded himself. Later ambush attempt also was routed by a determined charge by Dallas. Unfortunately, he developed a drinking problem and got fired from his law job. But he hung around El Paso, got into a shooting scrape at the Acme Saloon, and then tangled with the Manning brothers in their saloon. Dallas and Doc Manning shot each other, wrestled and fought, and then Jim Manning jumped Dallas, shot him in the head, and pistol whipped the corpse. Now, what about Billy the Kid? All right, those of my generation and older grew up thinking that he was named Billy Bonney and that he killed 21 men, 1 for every year of his life. Well, we know a lot more about Billy the Kid now. We know that the kid killed a man when he was a teenager. He helped kill Frank Baker and William Martin, and he helped kill Sheriff William Bailey and Deputy George Hyman. Just possibly killed Bob Beckwith, although I think that was probably a friendly fire thing, crossfire. He did shoot Joe Grant to death in Fort Sumner. When he shot his way out of the Lincoln County Courthouse, he killed 2 guards. So we know that he killed 4 men, and he helped kill 5 more. Now, that's not 21, but that's a lot of people to shoot. And during the Lincoln County War, he was in skirmishes, running, fights, ambushes, the 5-day Battle of Lincoln. In a 4-year period, I count 16 shootouts. Man, that's more than Ben Thompson with his 14 and almost anybody else. That's twice as many as Hickok or Selman or Studenmeyer. Oh yeah, Billy the Kid was a gunfighter of the top order. Billy the Kid had a running buddy that I wrote a biography of, Henry Brown. Brown killed his first man, as I mentioned, when he was 18 in the Texas Panhandle. He hired his guns out. He fled the Panhandle because of that killing, and he went into Lincoln County, New Mexico, hired his guns out, wound up on both sides. He was in the running fights and the skirmishes and the ambushes and then the Battle of Lincoln. But when he and the kid and some others drove a herd of stolen cattle to Tascosa, the kid came back Texas, to New Mexico and got killed, but he stayed in Texas. Henry put on 2 badges eventually, wound up deputy of Caldwell, the last and wildest Kansas cow town on the Chisholm Trail. He scared off the marshal, got promoted. Then he hired a hard case out of Texas to be his deputy, and he tamed Caldwell. He killed an Indian. They were so pleased with his work, the Indian was drunk and causing problems. They presented him with his beautiful engraved Winchester, and so then he killed a gambler in the street with that. And those were the only 2 killings while he was marshal of Caldwell. Then, however, he got married. And he bought a house, and he bought a milk cow, and he bought furniture, and so all of a sudden he was in debt for the first time in his life. So he and his deputy and a couple other guys robbed the bank at Medicine Lodge. He killed the bank president with that famous Winchester. They got chased down by a posse, got lynched that night. He was shotgunned trying to break out of the crowd. But from 1876 to 84, those years he was 18 to 26, he was involved in 10 shootings, and he killed 4 men, and he had 4 assists. All right, now what about Doc Holliday? From 1875 through 84, from the time he was 21 until he was 34 and beginning to die, from Texas to New Mexico to Arizona to Colorado, and most prominently at the OK Corral, Doc got into 8 gunfights. He killed 2 men with 2 assists, and he wounded some others. And of course, like Billy the Kid and Hickok and a few other men, he radiates today that indefinable but irresistible mystique that fascinates us. Well, that same deadly mystique surrounds White, Berry, Stapp, Earp. Now, we have a panel of foremost Earp experts here who are going to share their expertise with us, and I'm sure they can convince us that White is one of the best shootists. I look forward to hearing them hold forth on that. Now, I don't know if you've kept count, but all of that adds up to 10 men, a top 10, so to speak. I'm sure you're familiar with the old Western phrase, 5 beans in a wheel. You know, those 6 guns didn't have a safety on them, and they'd load 5 and then leave the hammer resting on an empty chamber as a safety. So that's 5 beans in the wheel. All right. If you were a 2-gun man like Hickok, Wes Hardin, long-haired Jim Courtright, Dallas Studemeyer, George Flatt, Henry Brown, Commodore Perry Owens, you had 10 cartridges in your guns. Okay, what about those other 2 slots? And what about your cartridge belt? Well, I mentioned 10 men who were in as many shootouts as anybody, and more than most, and who shot more people in more or less fair fights than anybody. I don't know a more accurate measurement of a gunfighter. Number of fights he was in indicates his willingness to use a gun. The number of deaths he caused indicate just how good a shot he was under pressure. Anyway, I've left 2 empty chambers for your favorites. And what about that cartridge belt? Well, that's a good place for some pretty deadly honorable mentions. Let me just mention a few possibilities. There's a law officer who's often overlooked, except by the baker's dozen of men he shot, the border boss, John Hughes. He got into his first shooting scrape in Oklahoma when he was 15. He took a rifle bullet through his clothing, was nearly knifed, and he caught a slug that permanently crippled his right arm. But he taught himself to handle a gun so expertly with his left hand that most people thought he was a natural southpaw. He's a lifelong bachelor, became a Texas rancher. When 6 rustlers stole his horse herd, he saddled up, tracked them for a year, traveled 1,200 miles, used up 9 mounts, spent all but 76 cents of the $43 that he took with him. But he recovered the horses, killed 3 of the rustlers, captured 2 of the survivors. He became a legendary Texas Ranger captain operating out of El Paso, participating in 12 shootouts during a long career. He killed 3 men, helped kill 8 others, wounded several others. Also in my cartridge belt, Heck Thomas. If I were a Western outlaw, I wouldn't want any part of him. He was in at least 10 shootouts, killed 1 man outright, helped kill 3 others, and he put a slug into several other fugitives. I'd also like Pat Garrett in one of my belt loops. That implacable manhunter killed Billy the Kid and a buffalo skinner, and he helped kill 2 other fugitives in 6 fights. All right, if you mentioned Pat Garrett, what about another manhunter, Texas John Slaughter, who took off after rustlers and outlaws and was sheriff of Cochise County, which he helped tame with his guns. In 8 shootings, he killed 4 men, helped kill 2 others. What about El Fago Baca? Boy, anybody can hold off whatever it was, 80 cowboys maybe, for 3 days, killed some of them, shot several of them. Boy, he goes into my cartridge belt. Now, that happened when he was 19, but for good measure, 31 years later, in El Paso, when he was 50, he showed he was still not a man to be trifled with, because at the Paso del Norte Hotel in 1915, he was trifled with by Celestino Otero, who shot at him. El Fago pulled a gun, pumped 2 slugs into Otero's chest, and killed him. Any cartridge belt would have to have a loop for Commodore Perry Owens. Sheriff up at Holbrook, well, you know, he was in various gunfights, but he got into that classic thing in a house that's still there. He took on basically a house full of guys who were trying to shoot him. Instead, he killed 3 of them and badly wounded another. My great-grandfather in the 1870s cowboyed for a man who's been largely overlooked, a deadly rancher named Pink Higgins. Pink preferred a rifle. He did not like to use a handgun, and he used it all his life. Started hunting Indians because he lived on that frontier when he was really just a little kid. One time he found a rustler butchering one of his cows. He dropped him with a Winchester bullet and stuffed the dead thief inside the cow's body cavity. He was mad, and he rode into Lampasas, turned himself into the sheriff, telling him where he could, quote, find a miracle taking place, cow giving birth to a man. Pink got into the range war, the famous range war, the Harrell-Higgins feud. He killed at least one of the Harrell brothers. There were 7 Harrell brothers, and only one of them died in bed. That was a raunchy range war. And 100 years ago, this year, when he was in his 50s, a stock detective named Bill Standifer began to have trouble with him, and they met near Pink's house, a rifle duel out in a very lonely spot, and Standifer killed Pink's horse, but Pink killed Standifer, and they buried him right there. I guess it's about the loneliest gravesite in the West. 8 gunfights that I know of, 5 dead men, several wounded. Pink would have to go into my cartridge belt. Another one like that is Arizona Ranger Captain and longtime Sheriff of Cochise County, 3 terms, Harry Wheeler. Wheeler was a superb shot with rifle or pistol, champion contest marksman throughout his life. But he almost came along too late, like Jeff Kidder, another brilliant gunman who was a ranger. He gravitated to Arizona because there was still a little action here right at the turn of the century. In 1904, Sergeant Wheeler of the Rangers gunned down a man who was trying to rob a saloon in Tucson. In 1907, Lieutenant Wheeler participated in a spectacular gunfight, one of the classic mano-a-mano duels in Western history. In Benson, right over here, about 35 miles from here, Wheeler tried to arrest a guy named J.A. Tracy as he got off the train. Tracy pulled a revolver, snapped off a shot. Wheeler palmed his 6th gun and just relentlessly stalked Tracy right in front of the train, put one bullet after another. Of his 5 rounds, he hit him 4 times, hit him here and just straight down. Finally, the guy fell down and said, "I'm all in." Wheeler had been hit once near the groin, but he limped on forward. His gun was empty now. Well, Tracy treacherously had saved 2 rounds, and he fired again, hit him once, and Wheeler was so mad he started picking up rocks and throwing those rocks at him. And, boy, there's that gunfighter mentality. And now Tracy was all in. He was empty. They loaded him on a train. The 2 men shook hands. Tracy said, "I'll get you next time." But Tracy died 10 miles down the road. They were trying to take him to the hospital in Tucson. Then in 1908, Captain Wheeler of the Rangers, another officer, killed an outlaw leader near Bisbee. Trouble was, by that time, the Wild West just wasn't very wild anymore. Cole Younger, I mentioned him earlier in his first shootout with a spectacular shot. And boy, he was in a number of fights. It's kind of fuzzy. I count at least 7 shootings that seem reliable, killed 3 men. I'm going to tell you something. You know how a lot of good boxers can take a punch? Well, this guy, I guess gunfighters ought to be able to take a bullet. After Northfield, he didn't surrender, and they had that 2-week pursuit by a posse, and when they finally rounded him up with his brothers Bob and Jim, who were desperately wounded, he had 11 holes in him. and I think some of it was buckshot. He was thrown into a wagon. They went back to Northfield. When the wagon entered town, Cole somehow stood up, made a sweeping bow to the ladies. There's that mentality again. Here's a deadly, deadly gunman, Harvey Logan, the tiger of the Wild Bunch. He killed sheriffs in Wyoming and Utah and Arizona. From 1894 to 1904, I count 11 gunfights for Harvey Logan, with 9 dead men and several others wounded. Now, one last thing. I want to take just a couple of minutes to say something about the greatest gunfights. You have to start, of course, with the most famous of them all, the gunfight at the OK Corral. The Earp brothers and Doc Holliday marching down to that corral and killing the 2 McLaury brothers and Billy Clanton in Tombstone, that's classic. 3 dead and most of the survivors wounded or at least nicked. Of course, I'm sure we'll hear much more about the OK Corral from our panel. But interestingly enough, in Tascosa, a few years later, 86, a long festering difficulty erupted about 2 a.m. in the big fight. 4 men were killed as opposed to the 3 in Tombstone, and others were wounded. So why didn't this become the classic gunfight? I don't know. Lewis Gow, one of the participants, was called the Catfish Kid. Now, I don't know. Doc Holliday and the Earps or the Catfish Kid. Somehow it just didn't click. Better still was the Newton General Massacre in 1871. That was a great saloon fight. It was started when Hugh Anderson walked up to a seated Mike McCluskey. Now, McCluskey had just killed a friend of Anderson's. And he announced to McCluskey, "You are a cowardly son of a bitch. I will blow the top of your head off." Well, Anderson's aim was low. He hit him here. But he kept trying, and a general melee broke out. 5 men were killed and 4 wounded. And that set up the very best of all Western duels. I talked about it last year, but I've got to throw this and get in the mood for gunslinging. Here's this one. 2 years later, Mike McCluskey's brother, Arthur, tracked Anderson down to Medicine Lodge, Kansas, which was about 300 people at that time, challenged him to a knife or a gun duel. And he accepted. Everybody said, "Great." And they all got out in the street and bet, Anderson enlisted his boss, a guy named Harding, as a second. Large crowd gathered at dusk. Anderson and McCluskey stood 20 paces apart, backs turned to each other like an Old South duel. There was a signal shot from Harding, and they whirled and fired, and they both missed. But then McCluskey's second round broke Anderson's arm. Anderson crumpled to his knees. But he rallied and sent a bullet crashing into McCluskey's mouth. McCluskey roars, pain and fury and so forth. He spat blood and teeth, and he charged. But Anderson continued to fire, and he drilled McCluskey in the leg and stomach. So McCluskey went down, and the excited crowd thought it was over. But McCluskey looked up, aimed his revolver, and shot Anderson in the stomach. So now Anderson tumbles over onto his back, but he was continuing to breathe. So McCluskey pulled his knife, and he began to crawl painfully toward his foe. Well, a few members of the crowd tried to intercede, but everyone said, "No, we got a bet on this thing, don't stop him." Anderson struggles up to a sitting position as McCluskey's crawling toward him, and he pulls his own knife. Anderson slashes McCluskey's neck. Then McCluskey buried his blade in Anderson's side, and the bloodstained men finally relaxed in death. I don't think you can beat that one. But my goodness, we've talked about some others, and what about some of the bank robberies? The thing in Coffeyville, the classic battles at Ingalls, and man-to-man things. I want to mention one you probably hadn't heard much of, the 2-gun man thing. 1879, Occidental Saloon in Caldwell. There were 2 drunken cowboys shooting up the town, and they buffaloed a saloon full of men. But when they turned their weapons on George Flatt, who was one of the guys that did wear 2 guns, they said that hold it up, give us your guns. He said, "I'll die first." Boy, there's the gunfighter. One cowboy decided to accommodate him, but his shot missed Flatt, hit a bystander. Flatt went for his guns, drew both of them, as one of the guys bolted for the door, a guy named George Wood. Well, he shot him twice, and the second round hit him, tumbled him into the street dead. Almost simultaneously, he fired the other shot and hit Jake Adams, The slug went all the way through him. He shot back, wounding another bystander. You had to watch that bystander stuff in the saloons. And Adams then got hit twice more and fell dead. That's one we don't hear much about. Finally, this one. Jim Roberts, veteran of the Pleasant Valley War here in Arizona, 1887. A lot of people thought he was the best gun in that war. 1928, he was 70, and he was marshal of Clarkdale, Arizona. Two bank robbers drove up a car. It's 1928 now. And they robbed the bank, and they start whooping down the street. This 70-year-old Western guy stands in the street, hauls out his old single-action .45, plugs the driver, crashes into the telephone pole or something, and he runs over and the other guy surrendered. There's an old West guy with a Colt .45 up against these 20th century guys. I'll tell you, when you look at hundreds of gunfights and gunfighters, I think it proves the Western shooters to have been tough and deadly, fierce, and often cold-blooded. Now, in 20th century movies, Western movies, novels, TV series, they established a fast draw choreography that virtually never occurred in the real West. But in nearly every other way, frontier gunfighters were more rugged and violent than their 20th century fictional counterparts. The facts proclaim to me that there was more true excitement and personal valor on the last frontier than the screen or the printed page will ever be able to portray. I think Western gunfighters earned whatever degree of admiration and respect that we bestowed on them. Thank you.
That was a real treat. Weren't we lucky to have Bill O'Neill speak to us this morning?